Good morning, everyone. I'll call to order the Wednesday, October 25th, 2017 Placer County Transportation Planning Agency meeting. We'll begin with a flag salute. Please join me as we salute our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, if you are able, would you please call the roll?
Broadway.
Here.
Pesh. Holmes.
Here.
Nader. Powers. Here. Trevus.
Yes.
Euler.
Here, and you might want to reconsider on Hesh.
Oh, there he is. Ash. All right, yay. Okay, the next item is item C, approval of the minutes from September 27th. Any issues with the minutes on September 27th? I'll ask for a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve the minutes of action minutes of September 27th. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstention? Hearing none. We'll move to agenda review. I see we have a salmon-colored sheet.
Yes, there's just a correction that there's an item removed from the agenda. It's crossed out under item HI,
Okay,
or
so
H1.
we're gonna take that off the agenda.
Yes, that is not on the agenda.
Already? Now it is time for public comment. These are, anyone wish to address the agency board on any item that's not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll close public comment and move to item F, the consent calendar. These items are expected to be routine and non-controversial. They will be acted upon by the board at one time without discussion. Any board member, staff member, or interested citizen can that's an interested, not an interesting citizen, may request an item to be removed from the consent calendar for discussion. Anyone have anything that they want to remove for discussion? Hearing none, I'll ask for a
I
motion.
do want to add that requirement to our public comment,
What's
the
that?
interesting part.
All right, this is the time someone makes a motion to approve. the
Yeah, I'll
consent.
move consent.
I'll second.
It's moved and seconded to approve consent calendar. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any objections, any abstentions? Hearing none. We'll now move to G, our 9 o'clock public hearing, annual unmet transit needs, and I look to this way. Bringing that forward. Aaron?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair. I will be taking this item, Aaron Hoyt with Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. So before we open the floor to public comments, I just want to provide a little background and context on our annual unmet transit needs process before we get going. The unmet transit needs process is part of the Transportation Development Act requirements, which is a key responsibility for the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. Through the Transportation Development Act, it provides two different fund sources that we administer for our local agencies within Placer County. This is a local transportation fund and the state transit assistance fund. Administering these funds provide monies to local agencies for street and road maintenance, potholes, sidewalks, bicycle lanes, and also provides needed match monies for grants, competitive or formula grants that are out there. The other portion of the requirement is that we hold an annual publicly outreach-driven process to find out how public transit services are working for our community members. Through this effort, we reach out through multiple different venues and avenues to find out how things are working, whether there's any tweaks that can be made, and it serves as a countywide forum annually to discuss this, but it also provides valuable information to our public transit operators. The process culminates with a report that summarizes all the comments and identifies whether there are any recommended improvements that are required. There are three different recommendations that are made and that the board can act upon. Those are that there are no unmet transit needs that are no unmet transit needs. That's one. Two, there are no unmet transit needs that are reasonable to meet. And three, that there are unmet transit needs that are reasonable to meet. Those definitions are included in your board memo, and that information and report will come to you in February. following the review and any recommendations by our Social Services Transportation Advisory Committee. Our outreach, as I mentioned, takes many different efforts and outreach venues. We use flyers, email distribution, social media, and even the tried and true newspaper ads. We rely heavily on our social service agency counterparts, those who have clientele, those who are out working in the community, and who know individuals who may be challenged with mobility, getting to job training, getting to medical services, etc. So we rely heavily on them for this information and to help spread the word. We've held, this will be our second workshop this cycle. The first one was in Tahoe City on October 12th. We will be holding 2 more after today in both the City of Lincoln and City of Roseville. We've also teamed up this cycle with our update to our short-range transit plan that Mr. David Melko is handling. And so this year, the information that we receive from this process not only informs us of what tweaks, but that information, those comments also can then lead into crafting future transit services and programs that will be considered under the plan that David Melko, the City of Roseville, City of Auburn, and Placer County are developing for their transit systems. Going back to the tried and true method I did here in Tahoe City at a meeting one time, if it's not posted in the newspaper, it did not happen. So we still continue to rely on outreach through this method. We ran 7 different advertisements. This is a 5x5 ad that's run in each of the papers preceding the local meetings we have. While the unmet transit needs process focuses largely on looking at areas where their services are not supplied to, and there are not services geographically in those areas, there are things that do come out of the process that the transit operators in our local jurisdictions have implemented. And then there are programs that have came out of this process that have been requirements. For example, the call center has been a comment that has came out of this process, where it's a one-stop shop number that anyone can call within Placer County regardless of the 530 or 916 area codes. We have provided services to the shopping centers along Sierra College Boulevard, and year-round services on Highway 267 and Tahoe City area are a few of the different comments that have resulted in changes and improvements into our transit systems over the course of the last 10 years. So with that summary, I'll close with our next steps. Our public comment period will close November 17th. At that point in time, we'll start to review all the comments. We will arrange a meeting with our Social Services Transportation Advisory Committee for early January, fine-tune the final report, and bring it back to this board for one last public hearing in February. With that, I would be glad to allow the director to open the floor back up to public comment. And for anyone who is wishing to speak, I do have a sign-in sheet over here for you after your public testimony.
Okay. Any questions from board members before I open up the public hearing? And you notice that the representative from Lincoln, Mr. Nader, showed up. Okay. All right, this is a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing, and please come forward if you have any questions or concerns regarding the unmet transit needs.
Good morning, Lee Bastian, Sheridan Mack. And as Luke was at our meeting last month, he got hit with transportation. We have a lady that commutes from Wheatland to Marysville on the Yuba Transit System, and they only have 2 to 3 riders, and she wonders why Placer County can't do the same for Sheridan, because we have no transportation, no transit services.
Okay, now, would it be proper for me to give the members of the board
We can,
some info?
I'll give it to Sylvia and she'll do that.
Okay,
Good morning.
good morning. My name is Ludi Gutierrez, and I live here in Auburn, off of Deer Ridge Lane, and I ride the Dial-A-Ride. I'm senior citizen, as you could probably notice. I'm also legally blind, and I have problems getting around, walking. And right now, I have no problems with the dial-a-ride. That they come and they get me, and they take me when I need to go. However, due to uncontrolled by me, I'm going to have to move, and I'll be moving to an area to which the dial-a-ride doesn't go. It's still within Auburn. It's about 200 yards, from what I'm told, to where the turnaround point is to the dial-a-ride. And so this means that if when this move does take place and I move there, I'm going to lose my only means of transportation, other than, you know, my daughter or son-in-law, which both of them work full-time jobs and can't take me. So what I'm asking is that you retake a look at the boundaries. I feel that if you're going to support an area, you should be supporting the whole area. If it's Auburn, then support Auburn, and not zigzag throughout with various boundaries that we can't. You know, if you go just a little bit beyond that boundary, then we lose our transportation. Yeah, there's no other means of transportation for us other than a much, much more expensive way of doing things. You know, I know there's, Uber, and there's other things, but they cost 2, 3 times, 4 times as much as trying to ride dial-a-ride, and we don't, us seniors don't have that kind of money. So I'm asking that you relook at these boundaries and either relocate them, or on a case-by-case basis allow the services to come and get us when we need it. And with that, I don't know what else, unless you have any questions for me.
Thank you. Oh, we do have one.
When is it that you're anticipating your move?
Right now, the house is up for sale, and so it's all pending on the sale of the house.
Okay.
So I don't have a time frame other than it's in the mill.
Okay.
Yeah.
The only reason I ask is this process goes on for a little while, and we don't actually get findings back until next year. And it sounds like you will have moved and have encountered this problem prior to then. So while it's certainly appropriate to bring it up in this public hearing, sounds like something that we need to take a look at prior to this process closing, and see if there might be some boundary adjustment that we might be able to look at and accommodate prior to that. So I appreciate you bringing it up in this hearing, but it sounds like we don't have the luxury of waiting until this entire process is complete to address your particular concern and get back to you.
Well, this is why I started the process.
No, I understand.
While I'm still.
And you did a good thing by bringing it to our attention. I'm just saying we need to act a little faster than wait for the end of this process to address your particular concern. I suspect our staff will.
Right. Do we have, Sylvia, do we have her name and address on the, yeah, so you can, yeah.
We'll
All right.
we'll follow up.
And we'll follow up.
Yep.
So thank you
We'll follow
for,
up with you.
I beg your pardon?
I said, we'll follow up with you. One of my staff will contact you, and we'll find out the logistics of exactly where you're moving to and so on.
Yes, it's all on that piece of paper that
okay.
I
Yeah, she's
gave
got
them,
it right
my old address and my new address.
Okay, perfect.
And
Perfect.
I know that the lady sitting next to me, she's in the same position I am. She's having to move also. You know, when you get to be elderly and you can't take care of yourself, you've got to go where they put you. And
Okay.
I'm just hoping I don't have to lose my transportation.
all righty, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Phone number?
I
Well,
don't know if I put the phone number on there or not, but.
No,
No, we need your phone.
we'll follow up with you and get your phone number.
Yes, Tiffany and all of those at the dial-a-ride have my phone number.
Okay.
They know.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.
Now, do you need help back?
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Sandy Nelson, and I'm kind of in the same situation she's in.
Okay.
I will also be moving closer to my daughter because I'm legally blind. We'll be going blind eventually. And so sometimes us visually impaired seniors need help. We need help by the dial-a-ride. We depend on the dial-a-ride. And so without the dial-a-ride, we're stuck. And so we want you to take into consideration that these boundaries that have been in existence for so many years need to be improved. There are also other people that are needing transportation that are outside of these boundaries that can't get to Auburn for shopping when they don't drive, can't because of the boundaries. And so I'm asking for your consideration to look into these boundaries, so that not only me, but others that need transportation can get to where they need to go for grocery shopping or wherever, appointments, wherever. And so,
Can you give us your name and address, please? So,
well, I live at 123 Marigold Avenue in Auburn.
and your name, please?
Sandy Nilsson.
Thank you. And do we have a phone number where we can contact you?
Yes, it's 530-401-5633.
5633?
Yes,
All right, good. All right, thank you.
thank you.
All righty. Morning, Tink.
Good morning. I'm Tink Miller, Director of Placer Independent Resource Services here in Auburn. We serve people with disabilities, and I continue to facilitate the Best Step Transportation Collaborative, comprising social service organizations, transit operator representatives, Aaron from the planning agency, and anyone from the public who cares to come. We've been meeting together monthly since 1996. So I've got a few points to make. Colfax, we're still looking for a midday third run on the service. I understand they're looking at adjusting the schedule of the existing 2 runs to be more accommodating to commuter traffic, so people could come down earlier and be able to get back home a little later in the afternoon. So there's still a need for that. We still hear about that midday run for people who just want to come down for an appointment or shopping and then go back home. Luther Road, we're still hearing about the gap between the Placer County Transit Service where it ends and from the other end, the Auburn Transit where it ends. And so there's this big gap in the middle with no service, and people have to walk out to the 3/4 mile corridor point where they can get on the bus. And depending where they are along that point in the gap, they can have quite a walk or roll if they're in a wheelchair. So as we look into the short-range transit plan process that's going to open, we need to look at that. We heard recently about an issue at Ophir Road and Taylor. There's an individual that lives a little bit outside the 3/4 mile corridor to be able to get the Taylor Road shuttle. And the problem is that the road that this person would need to walk on to get to the point for the bus is very narrow, very dangerous traffic, very narrow shoulder, and he's afraid to walk down to where the bus comes. I don't know the solution to that, but we do hear that that's a problem, that he would use the bus if there were a way that he could safely get to the bus. We also are hearing about Santucci Justice Center needing more service. People go out there for many, many reasons, not just because they have a traffic ticket. They may be serving on a jury. They may need to go to family court. There can be many, many reasons. So more service at Santucci. Employment transportation. I've been on the Workforce Development Board here for over 15 years. So I'm not speaking for them, but I'm very aware of the need that workers have in transportation being key to being able to get and keep a job. So we need service that is earlier in the morning, later at night, and weekends to facilitate them taking and keeping jobs so that they can get to their jobs. And most of these jobs are small businesses, not big employers that have employee transportation programs that would subsidize the cost of transportation for them or offer a van pool. Those aren't available from small employers. We're hearing about the need for more bus shelters, and I know that Placer County Transit has doing, I don't know if it's completed a process of identifying sites that need shelters, and that they're prioritizing the Tahoe area for first service because of last winter's snow, and to get more services up there, or I mean more shelters up there. But it's across the system, the county. We need more shelters. And finally, it's not an unmet need maybe, but marketing. People are saying they don't know what we have. I hear when they talk about things that they need, I know that the service exists that they need, maybe not exactly in the way that they need it, but they're completely unaware of it. Some people don't know how to use the bus. They're afraid to use the bus. Especially I've heard recently from older women at a meeting I was at that they're afraid to ride the bus. So they need to know it's safe and what precautions the operators have taken to ensure safety of passengers on the bus, because they are very safe. We have good service. We need more of it, but what we have is very, very good. So thank you.
Thanks, Tink. Is there anyone else that wishes to address us on unmet transit needs? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing. You have all the information down?
I do.
Okay, very good, thank you. Celia, do we need to adjourn since there's not an item on the Western Placer?
No, there is. It's still item H. It's H1 that was eliminated. There's still the budget amendment.
Okay. All right, we'll now adjourn as the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency and convene as the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency.
Okay, I have this one. Members of the board, we're asking the CTSA board to adopt the budget amendment number 1 to the fiscal year 17-18 budget. Attachment 1 shows the proposed amendment as well as the adopted budget that the board adopted in June. In terms of operating revenues, there's a projected increase of about 3.6%, or about $67,000 a year, and this is primarily due to end of the year adjustments in the cash reserves and in interest income. On the operating expenditures, we're seeing an increase of less than 1%, with a projected year-end surplus of $250,000 and some change. And that'll be carried over into fiscal year 18-19. The increase in operating expenditures is due to a new budget being provided for under transit planning to update the transit coordination guide, which will actually help what Tink had mentioned earlier in terms of telling the public about the services that we have and how to get around Placer County via transit. There's also funds allocated to the agency's operating reserve. And a positive note is a decrease in the cost to provide the Health Express service as the board reflected in the contractor services agreement that the board approved in September. So with all those adjustments, that constitutes amendment number 1, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions from staff? Seeing none, is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address us on this item? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board.
Move approval of the budget amendment.
It's been moved and seconded to approve item H, the fiscal year 2017-18 budget amendment number 1. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the item is moved. And now, we will adjourn as the Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services Agency and can reconvene as the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, and move to item H, Placer County Freeway Services Patrol. Oh, item I, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have my glasses on.
Okay, members of the board, I have this item as well. We're requesting that the board authorize the executive director to issue change order number 3 to the Placer County Freeway Service Patrol Contract Services Agreement, known as 15-FSP-01. The change order number 3 is shown in attachment number 3. If the board recalls, back in on May 24th, you approved change order number 2, which approved an hourly rate increase for the contractor. It exercised the option year number 1, extending that contract to January 2019, and it eliminated the Adam service truck to accommodate the contractor's rate increase and also to remain within the budget that was approved by the board. And at that meeting, it was well expressed by members of the board as well as the CHP who were in attendance regarding the reluctance to eliminate the Adam truck. And so the board asked us at that time to go back and to seek funding to reinstitute the service. So Celia has scrubbed the overall work program and has found funding for this fiscal year. The amount is $18,000 to reinstitute a portion of the Adam truck service for the remaining portion of the fiscal year. The overall annual budget would be $28,000 for fiscal year 18-19. So when I mention a portion of the Adam truck service, the Adam truck has always operated in the evening. So we have sufficient funding, we believe, to reinstitute the Adam truck for Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. 3-hour evening shift, which is what it had done previously. We worked with the CHP to figure out the days of the week that would work best. They recommended those days. I went through and looked at the FSP assist data for the past 6 years, and those days are the days where there are the most incidents and the most assists in the evening. And so reinstituting the Adam truck on those days would give us the biggest bang for our taxpayer dollars. And so with that, with the approval of change order number 3, starting in November, we would reinstitute the Adam truck service Wednesday through Friday in the evening shift. And with that, I would be glad to answer any questions. I would note that there are also additional revenues that will come forward through SB1. The guidelines have not yet been released on that. It will be controversial with many of the major metro areas on how the money is allocated, but some of that revenue will be able to be used for expanding the FSP services. And so I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions?
For the benefit of those of us who don't know what the Adams truck is, do you mind
Sure.
to give us a brief overview of that?
Okay, so we, the Freeway Service Patrol provides tow truck service. So we operate a tow truck on State Route 65 and on Interstate 80. The Adam truck is a regular truck that is not a tow truck. It floats between State Route 65 and Interstate 80. It's a truck that basically is kind of a filler, and where we don't necessarily need to tow the vehicle off of the freeway, or where we just need to assist the vehicle and push it over onto the shoulder for eventual removal from the freeway. The Adam truck can do all the other services in terms of changing the tire, providing water if the radiator overheats, providing gas, a gallon of gas. And so it can do all of those types of things except for actually towing the vehicle off of the freeway. It does come at a slightly less costly hourly rate because it's not an actual tow truck. I'm not sure exactly why they call it the Adam truck. That's an industry term, but yeah, yeah. So,
Thank you.
sure.
Director Trebus.
Maybe it's the Adam truck because it runs in the eve. My comment was, I think particularly at this amount of money, this is a valuable asset to have, and that to continue that Wednesday through Friday, particularly since you say that's when the biggest bang for the buck occurs. So to have the truck out there during that time when problems are occurring.
Yeah, and all those people
I
on
support
Friday are heading up to Tahoe.
That's
So,
right.
Darn
They
right.
spend their money,
Right. We don't want them on the shoulder of the road.
Wow.
get their wallets up there.
Yes, I do not have a question. I just wanted to thank staff and Celia for your efforts. I know I had expressed concern along with the members of the CHP who were with us during our discussion, and I know we're honored to have a member with us today as well. But it was a concern in losing that, and I see a direct benefit. So I want to thank you for your efforts because I believe it does enhance the service that we are able to provide our citizens. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from board members? Is there anyone in the audience wishes to address us on this issue? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board for action.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded to approve the item. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstentions? Hearing none, the item is moved. Now we'll move to item J, Transportation Funding Strategy Outreach and Polling.
Yes, Chair Holmes, members of the board, this item is really, there's an action listed here, but really it's more of an information and discussion item. As the board is well aware, you've directed us to figure out how to fund the critical projects that this county needs to maintain our quality of life and keep up our economic vitality. And that's a real challenge, as we all know, as we've gone through the Measure M effort and as the board has directed us to regroup and move forward. And more specifically, the board has asked us to look at a sub-county transportation sales tax district. So building on that, we have contracted with TBWB Services, and we have Charles Heath here that will be speaking to you this morning. We also have Fairbanks Maslin, who has done polling for us in the South Placer area that would be the sub-county district, and we have Kurt Below here that will talk about the result of recent polling. And we also have Mark Watts here of Smith, Watts, and Hartman, who is our state legislative advocate, who will talk to you about what is going on with the districting legislation effort. So with that, we'll start out with the fun part, which is the polling information. And I'll let you know that at the conclusion of this, we do have handouts, so you'll have copies of this presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Kurt to go over the polling results.
All right, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Celia. My name is Kurt Balo. I've been here a few times in the past.
I always get his name wrong.
It's like Halo or J-Lo, but it's Balo. It's an old German name, so depending upon what cultural reference is best for you. So I'm going to go through the polling results. I appreciate that being described as the fun part of the presentation. It's not always the case, I suppose. I suggest that maybe as I go through them, if you have a clarifying question about what you're looking at on a particular slide, maybe interject. If it's more of a, what are the implications for that, maybe I can get through them all because some of the later slides may address some of those things that you may pop up in your mind earlier on. If that works for everyone. But happy to present these results again. So a few things about the survey methodology. We, first of all, had to design a different sample universe here. It wasn't all of the county. This time it was based upon the South Placer region. We got precincts from the agency, including the 4 cities listed here and some of the neighboring unincorporated areas. And so for the purposes of this survey, we're referring to this as South Placer. We conducted a variety of different of telephone interviews. The first week of October, we sort of got this through and analyzed the results, put the results together quickly here. In terms of the overall sample and margin of error, we had 400 interviews across the South Placer region. So the margin of error for that, margin of sampling error at the 95% confidence interval is essentially 5%. So keep that in mind for the overall results. We also conducted a few additional interviews in the city and town of Lincoln and Loomis. We wanted to get the Lincoln interviews up to at least 100, so we had a margin of error that was at least around 10%. For Loomis, we didn't get as much success there. We had kind of a compressed time frame. It's obviously a much smaller town. But the big takeaway here is 5% margin of error for the overall sample, roughly 10% or less for the 3 major cities, and then a bigger one for Loomis. One caveat I like to put in front of these presentations is that things don't always add up to 100% just because of rounding. Sometimes 1 + 1 actually equals 3. And just keep in mind also when we look at some of these subsets, particularly the cities like Loomis, that their margin of error is much more significant. So the presentation is basically broken into 3 chunks. The first chunk is where are voters' heads? How are they looking at transportation issues, and how are they looking at issues related to transportation funding? The second section is introducing the actual ballot measure that we tested in this case and levels of support for that and some of the spending priorities that it would fund. And the third section is looking at a couple different factors for viability. And then I'm going to pass it over to Charles to talk about some of the bigger picture implications from TBWB's point of view. So the first picture, the first set of things here regarding to the state of affairs and where voters' minds are in this part of the county, and they're pretty optimistic. You have almost 3/4 who feel like the county in general is headed in the right direction. And we have a comparison point, and I have a few of these sprinkled in here where appropriate. We asked the same question last October, so just about exactly a year ago. It was kind of in the same ballpark, 68%. That's only plus or minus 5 points there, but got a fair amount of enthusiasm, or at least optimism, from voters in the county. This is a question everyone seems to like to see, is a favorability question. So we read these different government agency entities in a random order and said, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of them? And then pushed them as that vary or somewhat to gauge intensity. The shades of blue are bars that had a favorable opinion. So the colors may have come a little differently here, but these sort of orangish, brownish colors were unfavorable, and we summarized those on the right-hand side. The gray bars were shades of, I've never heard of this agency, or I don't have an opinion. I think the big striking finding here is for the 3 cities in the town that I've listed here, very strong favorable numbers. More than 7 in 10 voters had a favorable impression of these different local cities and towns, and about close to a third had very strong positive feelings. For the county board of supervisors and the agency here, the ratio from positive to negative is more positive than negatives, but those gray bars get pretty big. The percentage who feel like, I'm not familiar enough with these places to rate them at all. And last time we asked this was in a survey in September of 2016, and you'll notice that the numbers haven't really changed for these 2 countywide agencies. So basically, generally viewed positively, but a lot of people don't have strong opinions one way or another. And this has some implications for, I think maybe Charles might touch on a little bit later. A classic question that we ask in a lot of these surveys is, here's a bunch of issues that may be facing your community, potential problems. You tell us how serious of a problem you think this is. Either extremely, very, somewhat, or not too serious of a problem. We tend to focus on the intense reactions, those who feel like that's an extremely or very serious problem. This suggests that it's something that bothers them a lot, may motivate them to take some sort of action. And so we intermixed a variety of issues related to transportation funding, along with some other things that are hot button issues that aren't related to transportation, just as a comparison point. And we summarized the intense reactions, extremely, very serious problems on the right-hand side. And you notice that only 2 things were seen as extremely or very serious problems by a majority of voters in this part of the county. Traffic congestions on local freeways and highways, and the cost of health care. This is a pretty startling finding, because this is coming on the heels of what was a rancorous summer of debates about health care, certainly at the federal level. This is an issue that's on people's minds. People care about it. They feel strongly about it. Traffic on freeways and highways is seen as an equally pressing problem to voters in the county. Going down the list here, I won't go through all these items here. I think for the purposes of considering what to do going forward here for funding, government waste and mismanagement is just below that at 47%. So you've got almost half of the voters in this part of the county who are concerned about government waste and mismanagement. We didn't ask this at the local, county, or federal level or state level, but broadly speaking have some sort of concerns about this. A couple other items that are interesting here is if you look at the The amount you pay in state and federal taxes, 43%. I feel like that's an extremely a very serious problem. The amount you pay in local taxes is way down at 29%. So there's clearly a difference of opinion about taxes at the federal state level versus at the local level. One other sort of grouping here that I think is pertinent is the potholes and deteriorating streets and roads and the condition of local streets and roads. We asked that in 2 different ways. But they were kind of in that middle grouping with only about 1/3 of voters who are really particularly concerned about them. One distinction that's not in the presentation here is that both Loomis and Lincoln felt more strongly about that than Roseville and Rockland. Right. So a few of these items we've asked in the past, and so it's somewhat interesting to look at the distinctions. The plus or minus 4% isn't really a big deal, but if you notice the top 2 items there, potholes, that's gone up 7%, and particularly traffic congestion. So that was at 47%, extremely serious problem last year, and now that's all the way up to 11%. So the traffic congestion problem is weighing more heavily on voters' minds. So getting a little feel for the voters and how transportation issues affect them, we did ask how many people have someone commuting at least 3 days a week to work or to school. We're just sort of categorically looking at this. It's very similar to numbers we've seen in the past. Just shy of 3/4 have at least someone in their household who's commuting to some extent. And again, going to this issue of traffic congestion here, 72% feel like traffic congestion has gotten worse in the last few years, including 45%, approaching 50% there who feel like it's gotten much worse. So yet another data point. I don't think this comes at all as a surprise to anybody. And looking at this across the 3 different towns here, you'll see cities and towns, you'll see that this is a sentiment that's broadly held by voters everywhere in South Placer County. A couple other items in the news that we wanted to test awareness of, and it helps us analyze the survey results as well, is are you familiar with the gas tax? We didn't get into all the details of SB1. The signature item that was discussed most frequently was just the 12-cent gas tax. Obviously, there's a VLF issue in it as well. But we just asking about the 12-cent gas tax, 2/3 of voters said they'd heard something about it, including 1/3 who said they'd heard a great deal. For questions like this, there's a little bit of bias from those who may not have heard something about it but don't want to admit that they are unfamiliar with the topic. So we focus on that great deal number maybe a little bit more. But by and large, there's a good majority of folks here who feel like, I've heard something about this. And they tend to be a little bit older and Republican, particularly Republican men who are most familiar. Obviously, there's Measure M as well. And so we ask people, and this is always even a trickier question, do you recall voting on something, even if it was not that long ago? Voters' memories are very, very short, but a little shy of 2/3 of voters said, yes, I recall Measure M. And most of them said that of that universe, said they recall voting yes, which is roughly makes sense. And there's the profile of who is most likely to recall Measure M. There isn't really a coherent one. Some of the groups are listed there. But this just as a reminder that this is something that obviously spent a lot of time and energy contemplating, and some of you in your roles in the private sector advocated for, and it's less than a year later, and more than 1/3 don't recall it. So voters' memories are short and fickle, and we'll look at that a little bit and some of the results here later on. So that's section 1. I'm going to move on to section 2 now, which is the actual measure itself. And here's the hypothetical 75 words that we tested. It looks similar to what Measure M was, but it's different in a few ways. First of all, it's not countywide, and so because of that, we had to spend some of our precious 75 words naming each of the different cities and towns. And it's a little more focused on some of the services. It is really the Highway 65, the 8065 interchange, potholes, safety for students getting to school, and dial-a-ride. But the same mechanism, half-cent sales tax, 30 years. And we asked the respondents, well, having heard this, how likely would you vote yes? If you said yes, we pushed you a little bit, definitely probable. You said no, the same thing. If you're initially waffling, are you leaning one way or another? And it gives us this nice 7-point spectrum. And as you'll see, we had 75% of the respondents to the survey indicate they'd vote yes, and a little more, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter, said that they would vote no. I have some comparison points to prior surveys. I'll get to that a little bit later, but this is obviously a much stronger starting point than anything was the research we conducted prior that led up to Measure M. A couple key points about looking for a 2/3 measure that we look for on the initial vote on a measure. Obviously, you want to exceed the vote threshold. So 75% is more than 2/3, and it exceeds it by more than the survey's margin of error. We also want to look at the intensity of that vote. And for a 2/3 measure, you want to be somewhere in the 40s for the definites, hopefully in the mid-40s, and so we're there at 44%. So this meets a couple of the initial check boxes for viability for a 2/3 measure, ones that we were never able to meet, frankly, for Measure M. Speaking of Measure M, this is a reminder of where we were for that. So that ended up with rounding to about 64% countywide. If you isolate these same precincts that we're looking at and defining as South Placer, support for that would have been at 68%. So if Measure M had just been on these precincts, it would have passed narrowly. The measure that we're testing here appears to have testing at a slightly higher level. Just another data point here when we're trying to gauge the overall viability. And now I'm going to go through some of the demographics of support and opposition. So instead of going through a lot of slides, just the big picture here, demographically speaking, is virtually every demographic subgroup that we had enough voters to report on and analyze had at least 2/3 support for the measure. Remember, the aggregate number's at 75, so that gave some wiggle room. Levels of support, which were the highest, not surprisingly, were among Democrats, particularly young Democrats, all the way at 90%, young being defined as 18 to 49, and voters of color. Support was the kind of comparatively lowest amongst Republicans, but even there, it was still at 68%. The intensity was much lower. The definite yeses were much lower than the overall, but the aggregate was still at 68%. And geographically, again, the caveat that we have some pretty decent sized margins of error here. The total, you see a pattern here where Lincoln support was the greatest. So that's at 80% with half saying definitely yes, and Loomis down at 64% with about a quarter indicating they vote no, but there was no, these were also support levels that were comparatively high, particularly looking at prior surveys. Another way to slice it is, well, are you a commuter or not? Kind of interesting results here. So if you have at least one commuter in the household, remember that's nearly 3/4 of voters, 74% of them indicated they'd vote yes, which is just about right at what the overall total was. It's kind of interesting. The houses that didn't have commuters actually were a little bit more supportive, with margins of error. I don't want to read too much into that, but it doesn't seem like this is an issue that is just driven by I'm a commuter, I care. I'm not a commuter, I don't care. People, broadly speaking, have vested interest in a measure like this. The second set of bars there is, well, we asked you if you're commuting, how do you commute? I drive, I'm driving somehow. 76% of those drivings indicate they vote yes. 77%, again, I don't commute, said they'd vote yes. Again, this suggests the commuting patterns don't seem to be as big of an issue. The interesting bar is at 65%. I don't want to read too much into this, but these are people who said, I commute, but by some other means. I walk, I carpool, I take transit, I take a bike, something else to get from point A to point B. They're a little bit lower on the levels of support. Now, if you look at the language we tested in the initial measure, it's all about freeway driving, potholes, and things of that nature. So maybe some of those people who, well, it's not as big of an issue for me, I take the bus, just a hair less support amongst them. Here's where you start to see some more interesting and stark patterns. So, familiarity with SB1, the gas tax increase. If you haven't heard anything about it, your support level is way up there at 87%. That's about a third of the electorate there. If you've heard a little about it, again, roughly a third, support's at 73%. So that's roughly where the overall number was. If you've heard a great deal, remember who was more likely to have heard a great deal, Older voters, Republican men, they were at 64%. So still a pretty solid majority of those who are most familiar with SB1 indicate that they'd vote yes at this point in time, but it is definitely a much softer level of support of those who are less familiar with the measure, with the legislation. We also asked from after this initial vote, hey, you said you'd vote yes, tell us why. In your own words, we get a jumble of different comments. We try to put them in categories. It's an imperfect science. But here there was very clearly two drivers for supporters. I'm going to vote yes because it's going to deal with congestion or it's going to fix the roads. Issues about the school safety, issues about the resources for the elderly, all those sort of things weren't really on the radar. It is traffic, congestion, and fixing the roads. And amongst those who said, I'm going to vote no, it was very much just, I'm against taxes. I don't want to support a tax increase. You can look at a couple of these items here about there's existing money and maybe they should spend it elsewhere, or I don't trust government broadly speaking. Those didn't seem to be big drivers for opposition. It was really specifically about I'm against taxes, or I feel like there's too many taxes and this is yet another one. I'm going to move into the next section here. We're talking about some of the structural elements of the measure. And so one is the rate itself. It's a half-cent sales tax. We asked respondents, can you afford a half-cent sales tax? And this is a gut instinct, and a lot of people, probably couldn't tell them what the cumulative sales tax rate is in their own communities. But generally speaking, does it sound like something that's affordable to you or not? 3/4 said, yeah, that's something I can afford. Roughly 1 in 5 at 19% were a little, didn't think so, and a few were a little unsure. And what's interesting about that is looking at that, do you think a half-cent sales tax is something you can afford, and cross-tabulating that with how they would vote on the measure? If you said, yes, I can afford this, support levels are all the way up at 84%. Those who were more concerned, I cannot afford this, their support dropped to 44%, and a majority of those said that I'm going to vote no. So there's a couple ways of looking at this. Obviously, the rate has an impact for some voters. If they feel like it's something they can't afford, they're more inclined to vote no. At the same time, even those who said that half-cent sales tax is something that was going to, they're going to feel in their pocketbooks, 44% of them were nonetheless willing to sort of bite the bullet and vote yes. In terms of the spending priorities, this is a very similar list that we've looked at in prior research and was in the expenditure plan. And the scale we used here was how important it is to you that one of these be built or implemented. And the scale was extremely important, very important, somewhat, or not too important. And once again, it's easy to say something is somewhat important, so we focus on the extremely and very. Those blue bars summarized on the right-hand side. And you'll see there's pseudo-tiering these, and the boundaries of these tiers are very fuzzy because of the margin of error, but things that got to about 2/3, 66% or higher in the extremely or very important category. The 80-65 interchange, Highway 65 widening. Fall behind that, a couple items involving safety, getting kids to school safely, and bridge repairs, kind of in the safety bucket. And then the third kind of category there was being eligible for matching funds. That is broadly the top tier of spending priorities. There's obviously some variations, and you can make arguments for other items falling into that category since they only fall a few points behind, but I think that's pretty consistent with the research we've conducted in the past. I'm going to go through and just highlight a couple of items here that are interesting. When we get into road repairs, they all seem to be kind of mostly in this middle tier. So if I asked you why you voted yes, it was traffic congestion and road repairs. In that earlier question, what are the biggest problems? It was traffic, and road repairs was in the middle. When we give these specific priorities, traffic is still above road repairs. So it seems like that is a secondary priority. When we talk about congestion relief, we talk broadly about reducing it throughout the county. That's only 59%, extremely very important, kind of in the middle. When we talk about these other hot spots, we talk about very specific things like Placer Parkway, and other specific things, they're second tier. It is really 80-65, widening 65 itself. Those really are in a group of their own. Safety issues, if you notice up here on the first slide, safe routes for children, and making sure bridges are safe. Top tier, talking about improving road safety broadly. Sort of middle tier, talking about road safety for drivers, pedestrians, cyclists, sort of middle tier. So it seems like there's a separation there. It's getting kids to school safely, and bridges are in a different category as well. And the third set of these slides here, there are only a few items that fell below 50%, and it had to do with more specific bottlenecks. When we start talking about specific roads, and we're not talking about the big highway, freeway situations, they were definitely down the list. And you'll notice that some of the specific roadway improvements were, see, the communities where the roadway improvements were the most, the pothole repairs were the most important were for Loomis. That was up there a little bit, and for Lincoln. The two places where they had the biggest concerns about potholes, they tended to be the communities that prioritize those a little bit higher than when we got into Roseville and Rockland. Last section is about different viability factors we consider. One of the things we do in the survey is we get the initial vote, and then we do a crude simulation of what might happen if there's community dialogue. It's put on the ballot, there's arguments for and against it, what's going to happen. We went through the same exercise with the surveys leading up to Measure M as well, and the overall arc looks very similar, but you're starting from a much higher point. So the overall support level is at 75%. We said, here are some reasons why this is a great idea, and it goes up 1 point. Virtually no change, either in aggregate or in intensity. So that was basically, you're starting at the ceiling, and this is very, very similar to all the research we conducted leading up to Measure M. Very hard to push it up. However, pulling it down, a little easier chore. So after going through some negatives, it goes down to 68%. That is within the margin of error of the 2/3 vote threshold. So that's like, okay, 75%, much better than any other survey we've conducted on these issues. But the ending point is still gets to be a little bit more tricky given the margin of error. But sometimes that's not a lot of movement on the surface level, but it may mask a lot of movement back and forth, and it helps give us a feel for what kind of fluidity there is in the sample. And it doesn't seem to be a lot. 64% of individuals said they'd vote yes every single time we asked them in the survey. So it feels like it's a pretty solid majority of voters are committed, even in the face of pro and con arguments. But how does this stack up to prior surveys that we've done? Now, this is only of South Placer County, and below there is all the other research that's been conducted countywide looking at the development of Measure M and Measure M itself. And you'll see that support was pretty consistently in the initial vote in the 60s range, and then after pros and cons, dropped down a few points typically into the 50s. So this is starting off at a much higher initial point, and even though it gets within the margin of error of the 2/3 vote threshold, it is still ending at a point that is much higher than any of the prior research. So tying this all together, a few takeaways, and then a few observations about viability for a measure. I think the big takeaways are the issue of traffic congestion is not going away anytime soon. Voters are more concerned and upset about now than they were even last year. And this is really, really focused on the 80-65 interchange and 65 more broadly speaking. There are other hot spots out there, but overall, those are the things that really seem to be driving a lot of concern and making voters more compelled to support a measure. Road conditions are definitely a second tier. They're not to be dismissed, and for some communities it's a little bit different, but by and large it is about, it takes me too long to get from point A to point B. Measure M and SB1, largely, a lot of voters are aware of them, and they may have some implications because, as we saw for SB1, the more people knew about SB1, the less likely they were to support a measure. So there's a possibility that awareness of that goes up, may impact how people perceive a sales tax measure. In terms of broad communications, though, the county itself is just not a well-known entity, but these local cities and towns are, and they seem to carry a lot more credibility with voters in terms of communications. So in terms of something in 2020, first of all, it's a long way off. We're conducting a survey in sort of the middle of 2017, so lots of factors can change between now and then. But it looks like you've got a really solid majority of voters who are inclined to vote yes now. And at a spot that's, we end up at right around the 2/3 threshold after pro and con arguments, but this is a much more desirable place than anything was leading up to putting Measure M on the ballot, keeping in mind that we're still within the margin of error here. So it's overall, this suggests that the language we put together for the ballot measure, traffic getting worse, and the boundaries being a slightly different and focused on South Placer County suggests that something is more viable in 2020 than maybe it was leading up to Measure M being placed on the ballot. I know TBWB has a couple slides after this, but maybe this is a good time to pause to see if there's any questions about the polling results.
Yeah, here, is it you?
No, it's
Somebody's
me.
got the button. Huh?
I'm Jerry. It's me.
You're Jerry. Oh, hi,
Yeah,
Jerry.
Jerry Cardin's.
Oh, that's right, okay, fine. Yeah, so I was still, go ahead. Supervisor York.
So the inclusion of Loomis and any of the unincorporated area in this, why? Why did we?
This was a discussion we had based with the city managers back in April based on the results of Measure M. And there was a discussion about Loomis with the results of Measure M was right kind of on the border in terms of support through Measure M, but the city managers came together and recommended that they be included.
In the unincorporated area, were you looking at unincorporated west or unincorporated east in South Placer?
It was unincorporated west,
Okay, so
the
wasn't-
areas to the west of Roseville.
So it wasn't the Granite Bay area?
It was not the Granite Bay area.
That's, okay. And then on your specific questions on specific cities, were the results that we were seeing up here, were those questions asked survey-wide, or were those results specific just to respondents within those jurisdictions?
The latter. So if we asked favorability for a city, it was just asked the people in that city.
Right. Any other questions from members? Okay,
Excuse me. With this being proposed for 2020, maybe this wouldn't be a concern, but with the SB1, my concern was, or interest was, if that is put back on a ballot as a voting thing, would that have an effect on this? If there's one on there to eliminate and one on there to...
Yeah, I think that Charles may have some thoughts on this, but I think that the timing of this is obviously hard to predict because we're something to be placed on the ballot that's likely to be 2018.
Yes.
And then there's 2 more years before this could be on the ballot, and so it's a little hard to predict what the impact would be.
But this, we're looking at the potential of 2020.
Correct.
All right.
Thank you, Kurt.
Thank you, Kurt. So I'm Charles Heath. I'm a partner with TBWB Strategies. We're the consultants that have been hired to look at the viability of a subsequent funding measure and to advise on strategy and communication issues as you approach a potential election. So, as we went into the process of polling on a potential funding measure and in our analysis of the results, we've been thinking about a few different electoral options for how we might potentially take a proposal to the voters here in the area. Currently, the agency does not have the authority to call for a sales tax election within a sub-portion of the county. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Watts here in a few minutes, and he's going to talk to you about the potential for securing state legislation that would allow for that opportunity. But our motivation for the polling in the South Placer area was to really look at, okay, before we spend a bunch of time and energy pushing for that legislation, do we think if we were to put a measure on the ballot in that area, in light of the Measure M results last year, do we think we have a reasonable chance for success? And I think as Kurt expressed, the results are substantially stronger, and there's definitely an opportunity to potentially be successful in that area that doesn't seem to exist countywide. So that's sort of the first and most promising option that we see. Secondly, there was a recent California Supreme Court decision called the Upland decision that you all may have heard about recently. It's been much talked about and rather controversial decision of the Supreme Court, because it may or may not, depending on who you ask, have the implication of impacting Prop 218's effect on special taxes that are taken to the ballot not by a local government agency, but through the citizens' initiative process, so by signature gathering. And this was a recent decision of just a few weeks ago, and the legal minds in California are in the process of trying to sort out exactly what the implications are. As recently as this week, the San Francisco city attorney issued an opinion stating that he believes that this opinion does allow for citizens' initiatives to offer special taxes to be approved at a simple majority rate. Similarly, a well-respected attorney for the California League of Cities essentially arrived at the exact opposite opinion. So this is going to have to be tested in the courts, and we'll find out, hopefully in relatively short order, what this all means. But we felt like we should include it as an option here on the list, although it's important to note that this isn't an option that this agency could exercise. This is an option that a private group of citizens could go out and collect signatures to place their own initiative on the ballot, and that's what would create the opportunity to pass this measure at a simple majority. So that is an option that's out there, but sort of a step removed from your specific control. The other option that we looked at was, could we place a sales tax measure on the ballot within a subportion of the county using a joint powers authority, a JPA. And as the agency's legal counsel evaluated this option, it became clear that this approach would be fraught with some challenges. Specifically, a single measure could not be placed on the ballot in the area. Each individual city would have to place an independent measure on the ballot, and those measures would have to pass independently with a 2/3 vote each. And then you run into these scenarios of what happens if some pass and others don't. What happens if there's some disagreement after the fact about pooling the funds within a single JPA. It just doesn't seem to be perfect certainty that you could actually deliver the promises, the projects that you were promising to the voters in that process. So that's why that's an option that we're not recommending at this point. So all roads sort of lead back then to the prospect for achieving state legislation to allow for a sales tax election in the sub-district area. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark to talk to you about that issue specifically, and then I'll be back to talk about next steps in just a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Happy to be here again today. This is an issue that started about a year ago when Celia asked me to take a look at the possibility of designing legislation that would allow a sub-county jurisdiction sales tax. Found some historical precedents in the law, including the North Lake Tahoe transportation sales tax, but what we've also found was none of them had been exercised. So it was an uncertain question. As we were talking to members of the delegation early in the last year, a measure was introduced by Assemblymember Todd Gloria from San Diego, AB 1324, that would have initially allowed just an MPO that also had sales tax authority. So that'll cut out a lot of MPOs like SACOG, MTC, because they don't have sales tax authority, but it did address what he was interested in, which was SANDAG, the San Diego Associated Governments. We met with him, talked to him, and said, this might be a little bit better if you allowed RTPAs with sales tax authority. He amended his bill, so we thought we were on a nice track forward. But on a parallel track, another San Diego member introduced AB 805, which reorganized the SANDAG board, but also authorized the two major transit districts in San Diego County, MTS and North County, to have authority for a sales tax. And in both cases, that was a sub-county entity that would have had this authority. So we thought this is building into a good case. We'll be able to move forward with Mr. Gloria's bill. However, the fight around the SANDAG bill became ferocious, and the author of that bill saw Mr. Gloria's bill as a competing measure in terms of the sales tax authority and asked him to hold it off. So it was very disappointing development when he called up and said he's going to wait until 2018. Fast forward, as that AB 805 moved through the process, it got cloudy again with respect to sub-county jurisdictions, because the Board of Equalization finally woke up and said, well, this one might actually move forward to a ballot, and we don't have the capacity as they're currently organized, or as they were currently organized, to actually handle the technical taxing aspects for some entity that included city and portions of an unincorporated county. I can't go into the technical details, but they were ferociously against this. And as the bill moved through the process, the author struggled with the ways and means to change the legislation, and they did. And basically, they came up with an understanding of how to proceed, put it in the bill, and then we had to wait until the very last day of the legislative session for the governor to sign the bill. So we now know that at least the approach that's in AB 805 was found to be acceptable enough to allow the bill to be signed. What we're working on now is trying to determine if that was a one-off. Is it something that the balance of the rest of the bill was enough for the governor to sign it and turn his eye, blind eye to the tax authority? Or did he take it in whole and say, well, I think that's a good approach? So I'm working on that to find out if the Board of Equalization is going to be able to handle the new structure. The new structure essentially puts a lot of workload burden on the taxing entity to maintain an accurate accounting of the actual street addresses within the unincorporated portion of any of the of any such a sales tax jurisdiction, and maintain that on a regular basis so that people are properly accorded taxes or not recorded taxes based on their purchases or their usage of items. So it's going to be a workload burden, probably somewhat costly, but in the end, if that's the only way we can go forward, I think that might prove to be a valuable change that we could talk to Mr. Gloria about putting into his bill. Mr. Gloria is working with the Board of Equalization and the new Department of Taxes and Fees to see if he modified his bill in the vein that AB 805 has, would they be able to move forward? And that determination hasn't been made yet. So we'll be working on this if that's the direction. What started off as very promising turned dark and cloudy, and now the silver lining may have appeared. So that's my summary, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
So on that issue of the BOE just being concerned about being able to identify the situs-based sales tax and then appropriately allocate it back within that sub-jurisdiction because it has a separate tax rate now, it seems that it makes drawing the map of our proposed area that includes the unincorporated, because it's easy within the cities, right? I mean,
Correct.
fairly easy within the cities. It really comes down to the unincorporated area and how you draw that map. So if we simply looked at our map, and you said that you didn't pull in the unincorporated east, but just in the unincorporated west, if we simply drew our map to reflect the city boundaries on the west of Lincoln and Roseville, and then used the proposed alignment for the Placer Parkway as the other boundary, taking us all the way out to Sutter County and then down to Sacramento County, so that all of that unincorporated area is included. We know there is no development that will happen in Placer County north of the Parkway, per the PCCP, and everything else is captured within the city of Lincoln and their boundary. So just by drawing that kind of a map, that solves, I would think, all of that issue.
We're on the same page with that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments?
Thank you very much.
Mark?
Okay, so just to wrap up here, assuming the state legislation is achievable in the coming year, that puts us on track for a potential 2020 measure. I think the important thing to remember is that there will be, a marathon between now and then, a long period of time during which it'll be important to keep these traffic and congestion issues before the voters so that, we capture the momentum that was built up during Measure M. People remember the problem. They understand that this agency is working on a viable solution. And as Kurt highlighted in his presentation of the poll results, the cities and towns within the South Placer area play a really important role in that, right? Because they have a direct connection to the voters in those communities. They're viewed in high regard and are very credible. So we're recommending that PCTPA partner with those cities to engage in an ongoing communication effort to make sure that people understand what's happening. They're aware of the issues. They're aware of the limited resources that can be devoted to this issue now, but bigger solutions are in the works. We're also recommending that an advisory committee be formed to draw on leadership from within each of those towns to stay focused on this issue over this lengthy period of time so that we maintain some momentum and keep moving that forward while we're pushing for state legislation. And I think having some grassroots pressure from some of those local leaders could also help in achieving that legislation as well. Over this time, obviously, there could be changes in the economy, there could be changes in the political climate, so we'll also need to keep an eye on public opinion, probably do some additional research to see how those shifts might change support for a potential tax measure in the South Placer area so that we can bring back a final recommendation in 2020 as you face the deadlines to qualify a measure for the ballot in that year. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? I just need to know whether you will be involved in the public outreach, or is that going to be up to us to do all the public outreach? I mean, Mr. Heath.
That is part of the strategy, is that Charles would be developing the strategy for that outreach, and who actually does that outreach is going to depend on the strategy. You know, who is the right voice to express this message? It's not necessarily going to be me or Charles. It might be a member of that advisory committee, and so on.
Okay. All right, good.
We'll be putting together the messaging and the dissemination.
Mr. Nader.
Sia, when I spoke to you yesterday, you indicated that if we were going to go on this track, that the planning agency could not be involved at all.
That is.
Were we talking about something different than that?
Yes, we're talking about something different. That was the Upland decision that Charles had referred to, that if it turns out that it's controversial at this point to determine whether that Upland decision has changed Prop 218's interpretation, that a citizen group could put a measure on the ballot at a 50% majority. If that goes forward, PCTPA would not be involved in that, because that is part of the definition of it, is that it has to be a private group.
And we're not looking at that at this time.
Well, we have no control over that. I mean, on either, we don't control the courts, and we don't control any kind of private group. I think it is important for us to keep an eye on it and be aware of that, because if that does come to fruition, I would expect a citizen group, that was involved with the campaign for Measure M, also a private group, might come forward and put something on the ballot.
So that would be one of our bullet points, that we're watching that?
Yes, that is the second bullet point there, that we're watching that.
Okay.
Supervisor Bueller.
Yeah, perhaps a question for Kurt more than anything else. Our blessing and our curse may be the fact that we're moving forward with a fairly significant improvement of the 8065 interchange right now, and we anticipate that improvement being done in the spring of 2020, prior to us going to the ballot, should we go to the ballot. And so do we have any sense of, if things are moving smoothly through 8065 thanks to the improvements that we've already done, what it does to overall support?
I mean, I think obviously you need to have us do another survey for you. But besides that, I think it's going to be, I think broadly the issue around traffic is been very salient for a while, and I think that issues there may mitigate some concerns, but I don't know that it's going to address everything. And development continues robustly throughout the county, and so and roadways are still, I think the two factors could be something like that, which is actually does something with the interchange and also the state of the economy between now and then. Traffic tends to get better when there's a recession. We're sort of due for one. So we'll have to see what happens between now and 2020, because that could have some implications as well. I think it's a little hard to predict, though, unfortunately.
I'd like to add, the phase one of the 8065 interchange is not going to fix everything, by no means. Right. And more particularly, it does not touch southbound 65, which is a major problem now and a major source of frustration. It does do some tweaks to 65, in that, but it also doesn't deal with the the weaving movements on I-80 itself. So I think the problem is going to continue to exist. I think there is an argument to be made, and, you know, of course tested, that it might actually increase people's frustration that they see a little bit done, and why don't you do the rest of it? Well, there's no money to do the rest of it.
And from a communication strategy perspective, it's important that that story is told. As people see this work being conducted, they don't think this is the solution that's being implemented but not delivering the results I expected, because that could undermine confidence in the agency and the work that you all are doing. So it has to be clear, this is a step, this is a phase in the process, but there's more work to be done pending availability of funds.
I recall that happening when we improved Highway 49 in North Auburn at Luther, and people were upset. Why didn't you do the whole thing? Well, there's a canal there, you know, and that's a big impediment. Anyhow, I got some hits on that, and I addressed them, but people didn't. Why don't you just do it all? Well, if we had the money, we would, but we don't have the money, and there's a canal that causes quite a bit of problems for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions or items regarding this issue? Anybody in the public wish to address this? Seeing none.
I did want to also assure the board that we had presented all of this information to the city managers group about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and they concurred with the messages that are being brought forth.
Okay, good, thank you. Alrighty, if there's no other questions, then I will move on to our item K. And thank you all for coming, appreciate your input. 2018 Regional Transportation Improvement Program, RTIP in adoption, on page 64.
Good morning, Chair Holmes, members of the board. I'll be handling this item. Every 2 years, we update our Regional Transportation Improvement Program, which determines the projects that are going to be included in the State Transportation Improvement Program, or as known as the STIP. In previous years, the STIP has provided funding for the Highway 49 operational improvements in Auburn, also the I-80 Sierra College Boulevard interchange in Rockland, and also the I-80 Douglas Boulevard interchange in Roseville. In 2002, the board did take a bold step and advanced $78 million for the Lincoln Bypass, which attracted significant state and federal matching funds for the $291 million Phase 1, which opened in October of 2012. For the 2018 STIP, additional funding has been added from Senate Bill 1, and this will bring our interest-free advance down to $20.4 million. So we're getting closer, but that won't be until fiscal year 2023-24. So this is some good news in that we may actually have capacity in our RTIP for new projects, probably in the 2022 RTIP if funding stays in place. For this RTIP, we're proposing to program $510,000 for PCTPA to plan, program, and monitor projects. And staff is requesting board approval of Resolution 1724 to adopt the 2018 RTIP. And I will note your action item should read adoption Resolution 1724, not 23.
Any questions for staff? See none, anyone in the audience wish to address the agency board on this side? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to board for, we're asked to adopt Resolution 17-24.
Yes, please.
Approve of the resolution.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt Resolution 17-24, adopting the 2018 Regional Transportation Improvement Program for Placer County. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the item is moved. We will now move to item L, Agency Staffing Plan.
Yes, This item before the board is to update our staffing plan that is shown in attachment 2 that would add the position of a deputy executive director and assistant planner and eliminate the position of associate planner. And this has been reviewed and recommended for approval by the administrative subcommittee. And just by way of a little bit of history, which I went into in looking at this, at one time, this agency had 16 full-time people back in the mid-90s.
Wow.
And a lot of those folks we had our own modeling staff, we had our own transportation demand management staff. It's a little different world, a little different push in terms of how you could allocate money. Since then, we have refocused quite a bit, and between 1999 and 2016, we had 7 full-time equivalent. And then the rules changed back in 2016, did not require us to have a transportation demand management staff person, so we dropped down to 6 1/4 people. At the same time, over that period of time, that 17 years where we only had 7 people, the requirements of the agency have increased. We took on the management of the South Placer Regional Transportation Authority, or SPARTA. We were designated the Sales Tax Authority. We became the Consolidated Transportation Services Agency, or CTSA. We've really had to ramp up a lot of our efforts on the Airport Land Use Commission, and we bought the building, bought the Nevada Station building, which we're property managers of. So there's a lot of things we're doing, and as we're looking out at the next year, we've hit the tipping point essentially between the passage of SB1 and I'm going to go out on a limb and say rather onerous requirements, strings that are attached to that in order to obtain significant amounts of money that we need for our projects. There's a lot of reporting requirements, there are a lot of grant applications, there's a lot of data that you have to generate for those, not only for the reporting, but the grant applications, and it's just not sustainable with the staff we have. And especially with my upcoming retirement, there is going to be, I've got a lot of institutional memory, and bluntly, I've been working as a planner for that entire time. I'm not sure that my successor might have those skills. Certainly, it would take a while for them to build up the institutional knowledge and so on. And we don't want to miss out on money and miss out on, and not be able to keep up with our obligations. So that's the underpinnings of this staffing recommendation. There is a fiscal impact to this, and the overall work program and budget amendment that you'll be considering in the next item does include that staffing plan. And going out, making sure that this is sustainable. I have done a mock-up of next year's budget, and there are budget implications on that. We're looking at about a $45,000 increase to the request for administrative funds out of the local transportation fund that we would be bringing forward next year as part of next year's budget, and that's proportionately shared by all of the jurisdictions at a range of $235, and that's Colfax, to a little over $15,000, which I believe is the city of Roseville. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Celia on this item? Oh, see none. Anyone in the audience wish to address us on this? All righty. I'd be glad to bring it back to adoption. Does anyone want to make a motion?
Second.
Okay, been moved and seconded to adopt an updated staffing plan as shown in attachment 2 to add the positions of deputy executive director and assistant planner and delete the position of associate planner as recommended by the administrative subcommittee. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the item is moved. Thank you. We'll move to item N, M, fiscal year 2017-18 overall work program and budget amendment number 1.
Yes, this is my item as well, and this is a big budget amendment, a big work program amendment, because we're taking on some significant new tasks, and that includes, we would be taking on the overseeing the design of the I-80 auxiliary lane project that would be funded out of the remains of a federal earmark that we got for the I-80 bottleneck. And that would, as the board is familiar with this project, it would add a 5th lane westbound from Douglas to the county line and eliminate one of the merge movements going eastbound between Highway 65 and Rockland Road. And so that's an item we're moving forward on. We would be taking on the management of that design and get it ready for construction. And this is the project that we had talked about before that Caltrans would then be taking forward to provide discretionary funding. Hopefully, they would be taking on the lead of the project and providing the construction funding for it. We're also adding a work element for the gap closure project on the sidewalks on Highway 49, and that is being funded through a congestion management and air quality grant that this board approved several months ago, and back in September. So we would be leading the environmental and design on that project. We'd also be expanding the existing work element on Highway 65 widening. We've been working on the environmental document on that, and we expect to have that document to the board for consideration at your next meeting. But then we have gotten allocation to move forward on the design of that project, and we would be leading that, so it would be shelf-ready should there be funding available, whether it be through SPARTA, whether it be through a sales tax, whether it be through some SB1 program, which candidly is unlikely based on the requirements I've seen so far. But having a shelf-ready project is really important, especially with a project of that magnitude and importance to South Placer. We would also expand the work element project programming and reporting to deal with some of the implications of SB1 that I've mentioned. And then on top of that, there's all the ongoing planning efforts we're doing, the short-range transit plan, the bikeway master plan, and so on. And then all the day-to-day stuff, all the administration, the unmet transit needs, and administration of those, the freeway service patrol, et cetera. This plan includes 7 1/4 full-time equivalent staff people. So that would be a 1-person increase. And the budget is, of course, expanded quite a bit because of these new programs that we are going to be undertaking. We have funding for them, and it's about a $1.7 million increase to our budget to do these. And this budget also includes the additional money for the Atom truck for the Freeway Service Patrol. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Celia regarding this item? Seeing none. Anyone in the audience wish to address this on this item? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board for action.
Move forward the overall work program, budget amendment number 1. Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the fiscal year 2017-18 overall work program and budget amendment number 1. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any abstentions or objection? Hearing none. Now we'll move to item N, Executive Director's Report.
Yes, I've got 2 items and some sub-items underneath those. I wanted to make the board aware that we are aggressively going after grants under SB1 for some of the projects that I mentioned that we're adding to the overall work program, including the Highway 49 sidewalks. We'd be looking for ATP money, and it's Active Transportation Program. I have to remember my acronyms. We're looking for some funding for Highway 65. There is a little bit of money in SB1 that is for a local there's quite a bit of money in a local partnership program in SB1, but there's a little tiny portion of it that can be used to match local developer impact fees. And that's what we have on Highway 65. And we want to put together an application to try and get what money we can out of that. I'm just adding as a little color commentary and in light of our discussion about sales tax, as part of SB1 and that local program, there is an incentive to local jurisdictions that pass transportation sales taxes after 2016 that SB1 will give you a bonus of $5 million a year. So, you know, that's nothing to sneeze at. And then we'd also look for, sorry.
Quick question. When you're talking about identifying roadways that have specifically allocated local developer impact fees, would the parkway then not also qualify for this? And seeing as how we're already getting underway on phase 1 of the parkway and the county is fronting some of the money to get that going, should we not be looking at the parkway as well? Because we do have the tier 2.
Luke has been knee-deep in these discussions.
I was just thinking about the tier 2
Yeah.
fees specific to the
Right.
parkway, so.
I say we have to prioritize things. You know, of that local partnership program, there's 200 million per year statewide.
Okay.
And only 10% of it's going to these impact fee programs. So that's,
Okay.
you know, 20 million statewide. If we
Fair
can get a
enough.
couple million for 65, we'll be happy.
Got it.
Good, thank you.
And then, let's see, continuing on, we are also putting in, we are providing the information for Caltrans to propose a grant for the goods movement program for the I-80 auxiliary lanes. And the reason that we're asking Caltrans to do that is that if we propose it, we have to come up with a 30% match. If Caltrans proposes it, it's completely covered. And that, seeing as we don't have a 30% match, it kind of makes it a no-brainer on that approach. But we want to make sure that the application is the best possible, and we're working with Fair and Peers to develop the kind of data that is going to make that a much better application. Moving on then to the third track project, phase 2 of that, which are the improvements between Sacramento and Roseville, and really the bulk of the expense of that. We are working with Caltrans and the Capital Corridor, obviously, as well as SACOG, in terms of looking at opportunities to combine that project with a widening over on the Cap City Freeway over the American River, because there are 2 crossings of the railroad tracks through that section, and whoever touches that first is going to have to do the entire improvement for those train tracks. And rather than play chicken with the Cap City Freeway project, we've decided to join forces. We think we can come up with better applications for competitive grant programs by combining the 2. So that's an update on that. And meanwhile, phase 1 of the project, which will add 2 more round trips to Roseville and do the improvements in the Roseville yard, is moving forward. But there's also been, I'm going to say, late-breaking news. The layover facility that we have been planning on all along for this portion of it would sort of tuck into Old Town Roseville and had parking implications. But Union Pacific is now very interested in moving that layover facility, instead of it being in Old Town, that it would be out past Yosemite Avenue with no parking impacts to Old Town other than the new commuters that you would get that would be using the train. So we're working closely on that. It may require some tweaks to the environmental document if the layover facility is indeed moved. But Union Pacific has agreed to that, and we're a little once burned, twice shy, so we're waiting for a letter. to document that before we move forward. So that is the update on those projects and programs, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Celia? No, I don't see any.
right.
Any board direction to staff? I think we've given pretty clear direction. On item P are informational items that are available for your reading. And now, item Q, we're going to adjourn to closed session at conference room A.
I will also add, while we are in closed session, we'll be distributing the handouts for the PowerPoint presentation and memos that you saw in the transportation funding strategy. So those will be back at your desk when you return.
Okay.